Hey guys, today we're talking about RPE or rate of perceived exertion, a great tool that is very diverse and isn't just used for strength training, but can be used across multiple types of programming, as it's a great tool for modulating a lot of training variables. Now, RPE is so good because it accommodates for daily preparedness, which is a combination between our body's recovery and our ability to perform on any given day. Now, there's multiple ways to interpret RPE. I've got two scales here for you. The first one is one popularized by Mike Teixeira, who is a very influential and very popular powerlifting coach. Now, this one you can take into your next training session straight away. On this scale, we're using a reps in reserve model, RIR, reps in reserve. A 10 means you can't do any more reps and you can't add any more weight to the bar. A 9 means you can do one more rep. 8 means you can do 2 reps more. 7 means you've got 3 reps in reserve. So very straightforward. That's where the reps in reserve comes from, right? How many reps you've got left. So let's say I'm doing a bench press and I'm doing 8 reps and I could probably do 2 more. Then since I can do 2 more, that's probably about an 8 RPE. Now, the next scale, the next image I'm going to show you guys is probably going to be what we're referring to mostly for today, which is this percentage chart. And this is based off your 1 rep max. And so we can go to any of these RPEs down the side and the reps at the top and kind of triangulate what sort of weights we should actually have on the bar if we're training that given day. So let's say I'm doing 8 reps and I'm supposed to be doing it at a 9 RPE, then all I'll do is I'll go to 8, 9, and I should be looking at about 76% of my 1 rep max. Right? Now, we may not always stick to those exact percentages. And there's a number of reasons. First of all, that doesn't work into a lot of programming and it doesn't allow for auto-regulation, right? But this is kind of like a guidepost of what your numbers should vaguely look like. Now, many different programming strategies to kind of enter these numbers, but I just wanted to show you this chart. It's a good reference guide. Also, a lot of athletes respond to these percentages very, very differently. You have some people who can perform many reps of over here towards the higher end of the RPEs, while some athletes will not be able to get many reps at all. And this comes down to a lot of individualization, but basically not all athletes operate the same when it comes to these percentages. So keep in mind, just a reference, not the be all and end all of like percentage and RPE recommendations. Now, what I want to do, and what I mostly want to do today, is talk about different strategies of progressing your RPE or using RPE to plan out how your week-to-week programming should go, right? That's what these videos are about. They're about weight progressions week to week. I'm going to first start off by just showing you guys how we might write up an RPE-based program and give you some different like pros and cons of the RPE stuff. So, there can be quite a learning curve when it comes to RPE. Right? Like, how do I know what a 7 effort is? How do I know if I've got 2 reps in the tank or 3 reps in the tank? How do I know what my 79% is if I'm getting stronger every week? There are some sticking points, some learning curves that we have to conquer first. Self-assessment and the feel for your lifts can take a lot of time to develop. If you've been programmed 50 weeks in a row for an 8 RPE single, you're probably going to have a sense of what an 8 RPE feels like by that point. But if you haven't had that experience yet, you're probably not going to be able to reliably use RPE to kind of get a sense for how hard that should feel. And that's okay. Like all good tools, it takes time to learn how to use them. And if they're worth it, once we learn how to use them, we can implement them and get a lot of value from them. Now, the other thing I do want to discuss is early days, if we do want to combat the kind of guesswork that comes with RPE, because it's going to be a little bit of an inaccuracy. Don't worry, you will get better at it, but we can prescribe load range. Now, this isn't just used only for newer people who aren't as good at determining their RPEs. It can be used for a number of reasons. Now, the example I have here includes a load range, and all that is if we're at a 9 RPE, it might be a range of different percentages around from the previous chart. We might have like a 90%, something like that. There might be a range like 87 to 92%, something like that, that keeps you around that 9 RPE, but allows you, if you're under recovered coming into the day, to do the bottom end of that sort of 9 RPE effort or the top end of that 9 RPE effort if you're feeling really good. I just want to show you guys how I rip that out. So if you see it, you can understand it in your programming. And then we're going to go into the different types of strategies that we actually use. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, let's say we're doing squats. Starting off with 2 sets of 8 out of 5 to 6 RPE the first day. Back off so underneath here. 1 set of 8 out of 5 RPE. Wednesday, we're doing 4 sets of 4 out of 7 RPE. Now, remember, all of these would correspond to our last chart, some percentages. Now, not for every athlete, but as a reference guide, right? On the Friday, we have 2 sets of 2 at a 9 RPE, but I've also included a load range. So a 9 RPE for this athlete would be 242 if they're feeling a little bit not the best for that given day, up to 250 if they're feeling quite good, quite recovered, and feeling pretty strong. But back down to 2 sets of 4 at a 6 RPE. So that's kind of like how an RPE structure may look in your program. Now, I'm not saying this is good. This is just a bunch of random numbers I threw together. Nothing can be good if it's not related and contextual to you as an athlete. But this is how a program might look if it was written up for somebody. We're going to go into the different progression strategies now. And this is where this kind of gets a little bit more juicy, right? So we're going to start off with a static progression model. A static progression model is training at a predefined fixed RPE. So let's say we're doing a 7 and allowing adaptation to take place until the RPE lowers, at which point you add more weight and you get the RPE back up to a 7. So, simple terms. You're training at a 7 through your program. You're squatting 5 reps. Week to week, you keep squatting at a 7. Once that 5 reps at 100 kilos, let's say, gets a bit too easy to be a 7, you add a little bit more weight on the bar and get that back to a 7. That's what it is. Okay. I'm going to give you a talk through quickly about the example that I have up here, and then we're going to go into the pros and cons of this sort of system. So, week 1, the athlete squatting 2 sets of 5, then 1 set of 5, all at a 7 RPE. This isn't a magic program, it's just some numbers I wrote out. Now, let's say the 2 sets of 5 at 7, they're benching 127, right? And they say, or report that that's somewhere between a 7 and a 7.5 RPE, right? So it's a little bit on the heavier side of what a 7 should be. And their back downs at 122, they're also at a 7. So perfect, that's exactly what we prescribed. Week 2, come in, you might notice the sets and the intensity, the RPE, stays exactly the same, right? A predefined fixed RPE. Now, when we say we are allowing adaptation to take place, that means we're allowing you to get stronger, whether that's by better technique, better strength, better neural adaptation, or better muscle mass. We are getting better, right? And that should just happen if we're at the right training intensity and performing our program admirably. Athlete comes back in week 2. Squats 127 again. This time it's a 7 RPE. First week it was 7 to a 7.5. Now it's a 7, so it's a little bit easier. Their back downs at 122. Last week it was a 7. Now it's a 6.5. They've adapted. They've gotten a little bit stronger. So coming in on week 3, again, static. Same thing. 2 sets of 5 at a 7 RPE. They do their 127 and now it's a 6.5. Now they've adapted so much that 127 is no longer meeting the requirement of being a 7 out of 10 effort. So what happens? Next week, they add 2.5 and they go up from 127 to 130, and that gets it back to a 7 out of 10 effort. That's how static progression works. You basically sit there with a weight and you wait to get stronger. And once you're stronger, you add a little bit more weight on the bar and you stay at the same level of effort for the whole program. Let's talk pros and cons. Training affects your fatigue, the way your body feels, what you can expect going into a session, where your mind needs to be in terms of intensity for that given session. It's all going to be stable. You're going to have the same sort of response, effort, and fatigue levels from training session to training session because the intensity, a 7 RPE, does not change, right? This creates predictability in your programming. We know how you're going to feel for those accessories. We know how you're going to feel the next day. We know how it's going to set you up for further down the week, right? Predictability is very good for programming because it kind of allows us to know where the body's going to be at day to day and make a little bit more dependent decisions because we kind of know where you're at. When progression occurs, it is obvious and rewarding. So let's use an example. Let's say you're benching at a 7 RPE, you're benching 100 kilograms for 10 reps. You continue to progress for 6 weeks. By the end of the 6 weeks, you're benching 107 kilograms for 10 reps, and it's still at the same RPE, it's just a 7. So in that case, your effort never changed, but the weight on the bar is up. You know you are stronger, right? It's not even any harder than 100 was 6 weeks ago, and now you're doing 107. It is very obvious you've gotten stronger, and it can be very rewarding. What are some of the negatives? Okay, you will not get top end exposure. Now, what's top end exposure? Top end exposure is something that's near your current max. So let's say it's 90% of your 1 rep max and above, for argument's sake. Unless you're programmed for 90% or high RPE singles and doubles, you're not going to train any movements that are like your 1 rep max. And that can be a little bit of a missed opportunity in some sort of programs, depending on where you are in your programming for the week. For the year, sorry. If you're near competition, we need top end exposure. You need to be practicing heavier lifts that are going to be like your comp lifts to get your body prepared for the maximum performance on the platform. And so if you don't get any top end exposure for quite a while, then we might actually not be used to lifting those heavier weights when we have to go back to them. So it's a bit of a potentially can be an issue in certain types of programs. If I'm just doing 7 RPEs at sets of 6 for a whole program, and I haven't programmed myself in a day that I do sets of 2 at high RPEs, I'm probably not going to get any training at those near maximum lifts that I would need to continue to develop my skill or prepare my body to lift very heavy weights. It can get quite stale for some athletes. Let's say we end up squatting 2 sets of 5 at that 7 RPE. And that works really well for an athlete. Well, if we end up doing that for like 20 weeks, maybe that effort level, maybe that same sort of workout kind of ends up getting a little bit boring. Not for everybody, but it is a possible negative for this sort of programming. Heavily relies on honest and accurate RPE usage. This is a big one, right? So let's say I'm an overeager athlete, right? And I come in and I start deadlifting 200 for 5. And it's supposed to be a 6 RPE. And, the first week, maybe it's more like a 7, but it should have been a 6. And then because I don't want to go down under 200, I kind of like keep it there the next week. And it doesn't really feel any easier. It's still a 7. And then the week after that you're kind of like, man, I've been doing 200 for 2 weeks and I haven't got any stronger yet. I'm going to put the weight up. And it ends up being like a 7.5. And it was just because you weren't honest enough to realize that my 6 out of 10 effort is actually a bit lower than I thought it was. So you need to be honest with yourself with the RPE usages. And you also need to be accurate. And both of those things are really important. Sometimes we might be so thirsty. Maybe we're training at the same weight for 5 weeks. And we're so thirsty to add more weight to the bar to see that progression manifest that we just add weight to the bar, even though the RPE hasn't actually gotten any easier yet. So we need to be accurate with our RPE usage. And that's one thing that can be quite challenging in a static progression model. It may require a pivot, deload, or ramp up week to manage fatigue. If we've trained at a certain intensity level for 5 to 6 weeks in a row, we would assume that fatigue is going to accumulate over that time. At some point, that fatigue is going to have to be dissipated for us to continue to perform well. And so we probably need a week where we're training a little bit lighter or maybe a little bit less volume. That can be a week where we're not really getting too much heavy work done, and we might not make too much adaptation during that deload or pivot week. Now, that's still the best option for that program, which means that program still be done the best you can possibly do it, but it does require a conscious week of a little bit of a different type of training. This is probably the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest pro to this sort of training protocol. Once we figure an athlete out, if we think of an athlete's training as like a big circle, and in the middle is the bullseye, right? We're trying to hit as close to the bullseye as possible. So let's say we find it. Let's say we find out that an athlete theoretically needs 4 sets of 4 on the bench press at 76%, and they need to do that every 7 days, and they need to have a bench press day right in the middle of those 7 days. Argument's sake, it's just theoretical. Once we know that person needs 4 sets of 4 at a certain RPE, maybe it's 7.5, we can just literally stay there with this model. We can just stay there, keep doing 4 sets of 4 until it gets a little bit easier for a 7 RPE, bump the weight up, 4 sets of 4, bump it up. And we are now just week to week staying exactly where the athlete's most productive training is. Right? That is incredibly powerful. Okay, let's move on. So these are the other types of RPE progressions that can be used. There's a lot of them, but these are another 2 predominant ones. We have a linear block progression. This is quite simple. We basically just move 6, 7, 8, 9. We're just moving up 1 RPE a week. So it wouldn't matter if that was 5.5 to 6.5 to 7.5. It just means that the jumps week to week are the same amount. Very simple. There's reasons that you might start at a 5. There's reasons that you might start at a 7, but we're not going to get into all those. We're just going to say linear block progression is just going up even jumps each week. Who does this work for? Why would we use it? Let's answer it. So, usually, these sort of progressions are going to be used for people or lifts that are recovering very well. So this can be athletes who just don't get fatigued very easy. Maybe they're smaller. Maybe they are weaker. Now, the way we define weaker is if I deadlift 2.5 body weight and the person next to me deadlifts 3.5 times body weight, that athlete is probably going to have a harder time recovering than I would because I'm relatively weaker. Of course, that would never happen because I can't be relatively weaker than anyone. Useful for people who recover better from training stresses. Now, this can be that I have a very physical job, and so I then have a harder time recovering from training. But someone else who maybe just has an IT job, they can recover really well from their training sessions. And so maybe because they recover better, this sort of block progression will work better for them, but not as good for me. It's often used for lifts with shorter range of motion. So think of the overhead press or the bench press. They're shorter ranges, and so often they can progress linearly week to week, and that can work quite well. Those jumps work quite well. Better leverage lifts. So let's say you have mobile hips and really long arms and you're deadlifting, you're probably going to recover quite well, and so maybe this sort of block progression will work better for you. We have some more points about this block progression, but we will come back. Next up is our exponential progression. Now, this is a little bit different. It basically starts slow with only half RPE jumps, but then it rapidly scales up towards the end of the cycle. So we're taking half, a full RPE jump, and then 1.5 RPE jumps. So 0.5, and then it's 1, and then it's 1.5. And those are the RPE jumps each week. Now, who is this used for? Why would we do this? Here's why. A ramping style, an exponential progression, can build sufficient momentum in the early stages of a program so that we can then pop up towards the end and finish with those heavy exposures, those harder sets at the end of a program. Now, what we need to do is build enough momentum early on, but the cool thing is because it starts slow, we manage the fatigue built up in the early stages of the program, making sure you're not too fatigued for those last hard, heavier weeks of the program that we're running. Who would this work for? Well, we're kind of playing around with minimizing fatigue while maximizing your momentum for that individual. This can work much better for people who get fatigued a lot easier. So, for poorly leveraged lifts, so let's say you're a conventional deadlifter with short arms. You have to bend over a lot more, you create a lot more fatigue, right? Something like this can work a lot better for you. It gives you 2 weeks to kind of ramp the weight up slowly, right? Get some training in, make sure there is momentum coming into the program, but you haven't built so much fatigue from that lift yet that your 8 RPEs actually feel like 9s because you're holding on to too much fatigue. Those with taxing jobs that interfere with training stress recovery. If you are jackhammering every other day, you might not be able to train as much at a consistently high intensity level week to week without accumulating too much fatigue because your job already has so much training stress placed upon you. Those who recover poorly from top end work. There are just some folks that after they get past 85-90% of the 1 rep max, it's just they take a lot of fatigue away from that. And so this can work a lot better for those sort of people because it gives them opportunity to build momentum before they hit those higher percentages, and then we go straight back down. Stronger body weight to strength ratios. Larger athletes, not always, but often, have slightly poorer recovery. Lifts with long range of motion. So if you have really long legs, really long femurs, and you got to squat a hell of a long way down, maybe something like an exponential progression would work better for you. High fatiguing lifts. So I always think of like the strongman movements, like a yoke carry. This would probably work a lot better for movements like that. And this is like a bit of a nuance point. Those who need technique development at lighter loads. So let's say you have someone who, they just really can't get the best squat happening. What we can do is because the RPEs at the start of this cycle are very low and they don't really change much, we can kind of create technique changes and improvements in the first 2 weeks. And then what we can do is we can pop it up, challenge the technique, and then still get some top end heavy work towards the end of the cycle. And so it can be really useful for creating some technique change, testing it out. Technique change, testing it out. Really good for newer lifters. I should also point out that these do not have to be in 4-week blocks. They can be in like 5 and 6 week blocks as well. So I've just written out like 4 weeks here. Now, both of these have a really, really good benefit, or really, really good upside to them. Because the weeks start really, the programs will all start at a pretty low RPE, you kind of get a bit of a natural deload already. You have a lighter week, you can disperse some of that fatigue, and then jump right into the next program. Really helpful. The static progression, where we kept the RPE the same, needed a week of kind of like getting rid of the fatigue. But with this one, we can just go up and down. It's kind of like a wave. And so we can kind of keep training program to program without doing like a down week or anything like that. Okay. I want to have this like a little section at the end, some food for thought, maybe a little bit of a summary, just to contextualize a lot of the different programming stuff that we've spoken about. So you can use multiple strategies at once. You can do a fixed load progression with RPE, with some auto-regulatory strategies. You can do multiple things. There's no one saying that you have to just use one of these styles. Altering the tools we use for programming, or a progression model system, can enable us to think about training and understand our performance in a multitude or different ways, right? Just by changing the numbers on a program, by going through different weights and different progressions, we can understand how our body responds to things better, and even open up our minds of how we interpret and understand our training fatigue, training stresses, and stimulus week to week. Another key point is that each decision in your program should have a purpose. It should be based upon something that works, some theory, some evidence that works. We should have a clue about why we're using that strategy based on what we're seeing from you. And then we need to have a system to try it out, review it, and then make better decisions in the future. Regardless of the specific tool we use to progress training, we must remind ourselves that they are just that. They are just tools. There are world record holders using a diverse amount of strategies, right? Not just one. They might use a whole bunch of different ones. To wholly commit to only one strategy is to rob ourselves of potential gains to be made. If we get dogmatic and we stick to one approach, we might miss out on all the other opportunities to try other things that work really well. Now, I'm not saying you should try something else every other week. You have to really give something a good crack for a while to figure out if it works. But we never want to be too dogmatic in sticking to one approach, because we might be missing out on some sort of evolution to your training that is going to enable you to respond a lot better. Last part. I'm going to say this twice. Iteration based on rigorous note keeping and analysis will provide us the best trails to follow. By building the decisions in our programming around the response of the athlete through intelligent decision making and the high effort endeavors under the barbell, we can build as close to an ideal program as possible. I'm going to kind of talk through this little last paragraph. So iteration is new version of. So new versions of our programming based on taking notes, seeing what's happening in the programs, where the weights are going up, how you were feeling as you did those different weight jumps, and then looking at it and thinking about it and figuring out what works, what doesn't, and then analyzing it. It will provide us the best clues of how you respond to the training, and we can start to investigate those different avenues of what works and what doesn't. By building the decisions, those decisions that we've taken, that we've made, and putting them into our programming, we follow the response of you, the athlete. See what works, see what doesn't. And then by making intelligent decisions based on that information, we can build better and better programs. Now, keep in mind, we can make a great program. But at the end of the day, as athletes, it's your high effort endeavors, your effort, your adherence, your compliance, your work that will make you successful. A program is a tool, but a tool needs to be held in the hands of someone competent enough, driven enough to use it. As athletes, we're trying to build the ideal program. A program that sets us up for future success, that drives you forward into the future. And we want to aim for ideal. If you are analyzing your programming well, if you're note keeping, and if you're trying to make better decisions, you're putting yourself on the best track to walk forward into the future, into future gains in a much better manner. I have nothing else to say. I hope you've enjoyed these videos. I'd leave like a comment. If you have a question, you can DM me, you can send me a message, you can like the video, whatever you want to do. I don't care. But yeah, love to answer any questions that you guys have about this sort of stuff, or if you have anything more things you want to learn or any videos you want me to make, then I will make them. Otherwise, goodbye.